I became an architect because I want to be able to influence the way that people act and behave and experience life.
You're listening to the She Renovates podcast. You're listening to She Renovates, the podcast for women who want to renovate to create an income and a life they love.
Hello, everyone. Back with another episode of She Renovates. And today I have an architect and certified passive house designer in Audrey Whisker. Audrey is the director of a Melbourne-based firm called Whisker Architecture. Her firm designs custom homes that are comfortable, sustainable, practical, and adaptable. They're committed to helping clients save time, money, and heartache with the right advice from day one. So welcome, Audrey.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'm really glad you could be here because I think that this is a topic that concerns everyone, and we're all wondering what we can do while we tread that fine line between being profitable and delivering on our values. So thanks for coming to help us with that. And before we begin, can you just share a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. So I won't tell the entire life story, but to be on the short side, my family moved from Queensland to the Emirates when I was 9. And then I got to experience all the wonders of Europe because we were halfway there anyway, before moving back to Australia. And when I moved back to Australia, I moved to Canberra. And I don't know if anybody realizes, but there's a really big temperature difference between the Middle East and Canberra. It's really quite cold. So this is something that I've thought about a lot during my journey as an architect, but also I'm quite fortunate in that I've done the certified passive house course. So I've learned a lot of the science behind all of these things. It's also something that's dear to my heart because I know that there are people who are not doing so great financially at the moment, and working on creating warmer homes is something that will help many, many people. So yeah, and probably take a step back there just quickly. I became an architect because I want to be able to influence the way that people act and behave and experience life. And this is how I choose to do it, through everywhere we live, learn, and work.
Yeah. And so I'm going to jump around a bit because we have some we have some questions, but I think on the back of that, I'd really love you to clarify what exactly a passive house is. Is it a warm house? Is that what you're talking about?
It's a warm house in winter and a cool house in summer. So a certified passive house has to have gone through a certification process that is connected to the International Passive House Association, which started in Germany. So there's design tests that have to be done and build tests that have to be done in order to call yourself a certified passive house. Probably the most important thing with that, though, is that it has the tests on site. So a lot of the time, and I've seen articles recently as well saying designs may be said to have been a 7-star design on paper, but then when you get onto site, people are finding out that they don't have the insulation installed and it's not performing the way that they thought it was going to. So the key to the passive house is that it's actually tested on site, but it should be warm in winter, cool in summer, and use basically no heating and cooling.
Awesome. Well, that seems pretty practical. Now, you mentioned, and this is what really pricked my attention, was when you shared that a lot of old people die from inadequately insulated homes each year. Can we have a bit of a conversation around that? So, yeah, where does that information come from, and where do you see your role in that?
So I've got a few links to articles that we can share with your viewers later, but for the moment, let's start with some really simple stats. So every winter in Australia, we have a spike in deaths across the country of 14.7%. So that's every winter. And the CSIRO has linked 6.5% of deaths in Australia to thermally inefficient housing and cold weather. which
Wow.
they've also compared against Sweden, which has a 3.9% mortality rate. So Sweden, it gets incredibly cold, but we are still losing people every year because of thermally inefficient housing and cold weather. We can tell from that the people who are going to be the most vulnerable to that will be the people who are older and more physically frail, and the people who are struggling to pay their heating and cooling bills and choosing not to pay those because they can't. So those are going to be the people who are more likely to get that physical stress and then suffer the mortality from it.
Wow.
It's pretty tragic. And there's a lot of talk around climate change and how everything's getting warmer, but really what's happening is the average temperatures are getting warmer. What's happening is that our temperatures will be fluctuating more. So we may be losing people at the moment every year because of cold homes, but I see a future where we may be losing more people during summer, during heat waves as well. We know that happens in the UK every year during summer because their homes are not designed to deal with the heat. We could end up in a situation where if we're not significantly increasing the performance of the built environment, we're going to be losing more people every year. And I know it's not massive numbers, but it is people's family members.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And so let's move on. So speaking from the point of view of renovators, if you're going to make a list of improvements you would make to a house to reach passive status, what would they be?
So it's
and
really,
how
really
achievable are they?
Yeah. So I talk about passive house because it is the gold star. It's the gold standard of thermal efficiency when it comes to buildings. It is the best that we can do. It's really hard to do that on a renovation. So I encourage people to learn about passive house because of the principles behind it. The principles are very important. It's about making sure that the envelope of the building, so the outside of the building, is sealed so that you're not losing heat and cool through it. It's about making sure that we beef up that insulation to make sure that envelope is performing as well as possible. And it's about making sure that we don't forget about the giant holes that we have in that insulation, like our windows and doors. So those things are all measured and very methodical in the passive house system, but it's not something that we don't have to throw out the principles of passive house just because we're renovating and we might not have the ability or the budget to get to that certification point. So I think one of the very first things and one of the easiest things for everybody to do is get some insulation into their house. That's the simplest solution. Most of us have access to our ceiling space, so we're capable of putting insulation up there. There's a lot of different options when it comes to walls, even blow-in insulation as well. Yes, you're going to end up with a whole bunch of holes in your walls, but you can patch them. It's okay.
I didn't know that.
Yep.
That's awesome.
So you can blow insulation into the walls. If you don't have access, say if it's a brick veneer home, then we can also get insulation in the floor as well. And that's the order that we want to be looking at insulation as well. So if you think about your house being really similar to your body, if you're going to be getting cold, you're going to be losing the most heat out of your head. So put your hat on first, then put your jumper on, then put your woolly socks on, and then everything will be relatively warm. Then we want to be looking at how do we stop the leaks? So this is the equivalent of putting your parka over the top of your woolly jumper. So that's where we want to start going around and sealing as many of the leaks as possible. And depending on the age of the house, you'll have a lot of leaks. So get the silicone out, run around all your outdoor windows, all of your doors, all your architraves, your skirtings, all of those areas are probably going to have tiny little leaks in them, tiny little air leaks that are just going to be losing you a little bit of energy every time we've got the heater on.
And what about, you can't really change the orientation of a property, but let's say the orientation is favourable to passive housing. What does that mean?
Okay, so there's a really big difference between solar passive design and certified passive house. And I know they both have passive in them and they get switched around a lot. Solar passive design is an element of passive house, but it's an element of what should be every new building that's happening right now as well. So solar passive design is when we're letting the heat in winter and we're blocking it out in summer. So the angle of the sun that's coming around is going to be lower in winter we all know, we've all seen it. In summer, it's much higher up in the air. So that's about making sure that we keep the heat out in summer and let it in winter. And we make sure that we've got good cross ventilation throughout the home as well.
Okay.
If we've got a favorable orientation to the home, we want to make sure that we're taking the best advantage of those angles to get the sun in through the north, usually in Australia, as little as possible from the south, because you're not actually getting any benefit from it, and as little as possible from the east and west, depending on the orientation and the climate that you're in. And that's going to gain you heat when you want it. It's a way of getting free heating, basically.
Yeah.
And then you can do that by increasing the size of windows on certain sides of the house as well. And if you're doing that, so if you've got a window that's already installed and it might stop maybe a meter off the ground, you don't need any more structural lintels above it. You don't need to change the structure above that window to make it go all the way to the floor.
Yeah.
And if that's a good idea in your area, then that's something to think about.
Okay, that's a simple fix.
Yeah. You do want to make sure that the windows are good quality windows, though, because your windows are essentially a hole in your wall. There's no way that a 12 mil piece of glass or a 6 mil piece of glass is ever going to be as insulating as a giant wall full of insulation. It's just not going to happen. So the U value is the inverse of the R value. So the U value is how much insulating properties your glass has versus the R value, which is how they measure for walls. It is a tiny fraction. So we want to make sure people are using their windows smart and that the windows that they do put on are as insulating as possible. So
yeah, the only example I could draw on with this is our own house. And one thing we did, like long before we started planning the renovation, is we had a company in Melbourne called EcoMaster come and do an audit on our house. And one of the biggest things they found was the fact that we had so many drafts. And so much air getting in. They actually did heat sensoring and showed us these pictures showing where all the leaks were, which was fascinating. And of course, the windows were a big source. And so now that we're renovating, we're changing those windows over to double glaze. But even the sort of navigating the glass choices and so on, like when you go to a window manufacturer and say, I want double glazing, they have not got a clue what those different glasses do. It's very challenging to navigate your way through that because you're talking lots of money and you want to make sure that you're getting, what you set out to do. Something we've figured out, because half of our house faces south and the top part faces north, which gets lots of heat in, and the bottom is cold. And so Stephen's DIYing a system for bringing the heat down from the top into the bottom to get it to move around and to keep the bottom warmer. So, I'll let you know how that goes. It's quite...
Is it a little exhaust system?
Yeah.
That runs from the top down to the bottom? That's
it's
perfect.
Not from outside, from inside the top.
Yes.
It's really hot. Yeah, so some sort of way of blowing it down through a riser to bring it down to the bottom, because of course it rises, and so that's been our experience of trying to get some comfort into our home.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're doing it before we get old, because we're not old at the moment.
You've got many more renovations still left in your life.
I do. So if someone doesn't have the financial capacity to do everything, how would you prioritize?
So I was actually talking to another architect about this the other day. So Sarah Lebner of Kui Architects did a great case study on her own home, and they spent less than $20,000, which I know will be still a big chunk of money to a lot of people. But for that, they managed to increase the star rating of their home from 2.9 stars, which is not uncommon in Australia, to 5.7 stars, which is about a 60% reduction in heating and cooling. So that's a pretty big leap. And the things that they were looking at doing is increasing the insulation, draft proofing their home. I believe they installed their own insulation as well. If you do want to do that, make sure you look into all of the correct protective gear and don't do it in the middle of summer, and be safe. But it is relatively simple to do. Even architects can do it. Draft proof the home with the flexible sealant. So run around and fill all those gaps. Caulk is that sealant from Bunnings. You can get loads and loads of tubes of that. It makes a massive difference. Also DIY your window and door seals. So you can also go to Bunnings and other hardware stores and get seals to go around your doors and seals to go around your windows if you've got old windows as well. It does make a massive difference, especially if you've got older windows that never had proper seals, or the seals have deteriorated and just kind of falling off or not being useful anymore. And then we want to look at the other bigger holes that people forget in your insulation. So we're talking about your range hoods, your exhaust fans. If you've got a fireplace, all of these can have backdraft stoppers on them. So we can have those retrofitted on to make sure that you're not losing heat out of those holes as well. And then we've got the windows. So let's assume for the moment that we're not replacing the windows. As you mentioned before, it is definitely an expensive exercise. I do recommend getting as much advice as possible around that. You can get energy assessors to help give you the numbers that work best for your home. But if you can't change the windows or can't change the windows yet, there are a few different options. You can go with heavy curtains with pelmets. You can go with close-fitting blinds. You can get multi-celled blinds. So the blinds that have...
Yeah, I know. Honeycomb.
Honeycomb, that's the word I was looking for. Thanks. Those help as well. You want them as close-fitting as possible to stop the heat exchange happening at your window. So the warm air pushing up against the glass, getting cold, coming back down again, and around it goes, and it just gets drafty and it gets cold and it loses your heat. So that's what you're trying to reduce around there. Now, if you are also looking at the price of blinds and curtains and going, dear Lord, that's expensive. We're currently building a home, and I know that the blinds package on that house is going to be something along the lines of, I don't know, $18,000 or something. So it's not cheap. But one thing that you can do is you can put a little bit of translucent film on your windows, and then you can put bubble wrap behind that. You don't have to do the translucent film. I would opt for that just because it looks slightly nicer from the outside. But bubble wrap is essentially just clear insulation, and you still get the light. You don't want to be putting blankets up against your windows so that you lose any advantage you're going to get from light coming through, but you can use bubble wrap. It's very affordable.
Amazing.
You can chuck it up there and it will help, even if that means something that gets you through another winter while you're saving up to get some blinds or curtains put in.
And have you had much to do with secondary glazing?
I haven't. I know that it exists.
Yeah.
I know that it works really well in heritage homes as well. So correct me if I'm talking about something different, but this is when we're putting another piece of glass in front of your existing windows. The only thing that I am cautious about with that is that depending on how it's installed, whether you can have access to it, you might find that there might get condensation between the secondary glass and your current window. So you might want to know that you can open those windows and be able to clean behind or dry them out if need be.
I have seen a product that's a DIY product, and it's actually Perspex.
Mm-hmm.
So they have moldings that fit around the window frame, and the second layer is Perspex.
Wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah.
As long as you can get it off so that you can do the maintenance required behind it, that will look much nicer than bubble wrap. Don't know what the cost is, but the point is trying to get that insulating air barrier.
Yeah. My understanding, it's about a third of the cost of replacing the windows.
Okay.
So it's not super duper cheap, but yeah, that's where you were thinking of going. Okay. So now let's talk about, like, obviously with anything we do, particularly as renovators for profit, we want to know what the ROI is on those things that you spend money. Are you able to talk to that at all?
I can talk a little to it. So as I mentioned before, that 60% reduction in heating and cooling. The difficulty at the moment is that there's not enough reporting on the star rating for homes that are being sold on. And I think that's one of the real missed opportunities at the moment. It's definitely something that's being discussed in government. And I think they did a trial in the ACT. I'm not sure if it's still going or if they've made it permanent.
Yeah.
I think that's the logical way to go, because even banks are starting to look at star ratings for mortgage assessments as well, to see what your repayments will be when you're living in that house, what your cost of living will be in that house. It's not as much of a factor at the moment as far as a resale, but I think that's the way it's going to go. So if you're planning on living in that home for a good 10 or 20 years before selling it, at least 10, hopefully less, then I expect by the time you do sell, that will be something that will be heavily influencing your on sale price. But if we're talking about reducing your heating and cooling by up to 60% for a relatively small investment, that's definitely something that people should be considering.
Absolutely.
If people wanted to go down the certified passive house route, I encourage everybody to do that as far as they can down that path. It's not going to be something possible for all homeowners or all homes, because renovating it for it is very difficult, but you do expect to reduce the energy consumption of a home by about 90% by having it as a certified passive house. So the return on investment really is around how long you're planning on living in it, and what happens then with the market and how much people start demanding to know how expensive it's going to be to live in that house.
Absolutely. And I think, so you've included a case study here on an existing home that's 2.2 stars and the impact of certain improvements. I know it's probably hard. We will share this document because I think it's our audience will be interested in seeing it. So you've got options from 1 to 4 and what you need to do to get it to 4.3, or what was done to get it to 4.3, then 4.6, then 6.7, then 7.2. Do you want to just talk to that? Because I don't really understand when they're talking about the windows, what that involves.
Absolutely. So this project is one that we're working on at the moment, which is why I thought I'd put it in, because these are the current numbers and the numbers that we'll be discussing with this client. This is a typical 70s brick veneer home. It has no insulation in the walls. If it has any insulation in the ceiling, it's well and truly flattened after many, many years of living up there. And it has no insulation in the floor. And it also has old timber windows to certain areas and old aluminium windows that have been retrofitted along the way. So everything's very, very drafty, very cold, and the clients are done. They're sick of it. They just want a comfortable home. They've been living in this home for the last 20 years. They expect to live in it for another 20 years, but they're getting older and they want to be comfortable. So option 1 that gets them from the 2.2 up to 4.3 gets us that insulation in the ceiling, and then we swap out all the windows in the house. So that's all we're doing. We're not touching the walls. We're not touching the floor. We put insulation in the ceiling, and then we swap out all of the windows. So the notes that I've got there are showing timber windows to the north and south, and then UPVC to the remainder. That's talking mostly about the frames that we'd be looking at, and that was an aesthetic choice. So we were looking at having nicer timber frames to the north and south, which are the two faces that the client sees. So one that faces the street and one that faces the backyard. And then the other windows are on the side boundaries, and they're not going to see them very often. They're also not going to be able to access them to maintain them as easily because they're quite close to their fence lines. So that's where we went for UPVC.
Are they double glazed?
Yes, they would be double glazed. But I think that the same confusion that you were having when you were working on your home about what was happening with the windows and which numbers meant what and what kind of double glazing was what comes from the reports behind these numbers are 2 really important numbers for the windows. That's your U value, so how insulating is that setup, and then your solar heat gain coefficient, so SHGC. which is how much heat through direct solar radiation you gain with those windows. Those two numbers combine to make the rating for that window, and that will be different for different windows and different systems. So I can include what those numbers are for this job in the document for your listeners, but those are the numbers that are really important. If you've got a whole bunch of west-facing windows, you might want insulating glass, but you might also want them to have quite a high reflectivity on the glass as well to bounce a lot of that western sun off. So there's different things to consider with the quality of the glass.
I know the issue that we had was that they were as a standard, including glass that's for windows that are exposed to a lot of sun, like you're talking about. And our problem in this particular wall is not the sun beating on it, it's the warmth escaping. Like, we needed to get that big gap and decent thickness glass either side to make sure that was sealed. Yeah.
When you start looking at the different glass options, you can find that there are some double glazing systems that will perform as well or very close to a single glazed system with special glass in it. So specialized laminated glasses in it. That's why it's so important to know what those numbers are, because then you're comparing apples with apples of the actual performance instead of just going, oh, I don't know, just chuck the best in that we could possibly throw in. Let's just make everything triple glazed and argon filled and just.
Yeah.
But you don't know. You don't know how much impact that's going to make, and you can't make the decision around your return on investment if you don't know the data. So that's so important when comparing what your windows are going to be.
I completely get it, because that's exactly what we found. Yeah. Okay. And so that was 4.3, then on to 4.6, and you added floor insulation.
Yes.
Okay.
And then to get 6.7, we said we asked what happened if we only put it into the walls. So insulation to the ceiling, the walls, and the new windows, but nothing to the floor.
Yeah.
And then option 4 gets 7.2 stars, which is fantastic for a renovation. And that's ceiling insulation, floor insulation, and wall insulation with the new windows. Now, for this project, we will be going with option 3. And that sounds counterintuitive because it's only getting up to the 6.7 stars. But this is something that a lot of people with older homes will find, is that there's actually not enough access under the house to get the floor insulation in. And it sucks and it's frustrating because we can see that you can gain an extra 0.5 stars by getting that floor insulation in. But in order for us to do that, we would have to rip out all of the floor. That's a cost that this client just cannot justify, and we can't justify for them either. So what we will do is we will still get this house from 2.2 to 6.7, and we will seal up those floors as well as we can. And any room that's going to have carpet in it will have a good thick underlay, and we will make sure that that floor has no drafts coming through it. But that is that return on investment decision of going, okay, that's too far. That's a step too far. But you don't know if you don't have the data. So I really recommend getting energy assessments.
And is that what an energy assessment gives you? Well, we may have it. I'm just not sure, but yeah.
Yes.
So, yeah, okay.
So you want to work with your energy assessor to find out what's going to make the biggest difference to your home. And the energy assessments are not that expensive in the grand scheme of things. So an energy assessment from some of our consultants can be anywhere from $800 to $2,000. As far as consultants go and engineering goes, it's relatively inexpensive considering how much you might be investing in, say, a package of glass.
And can I just ask, let's say we get that energy assessment, we have some options in terms of how we can improve our star rating. And let's say we're heading towards going to market with the house. So do we work with someone like, if you want to have that certification on paper, is that a possibility? And who do we work with to do that?
If you're going through a building designer or an architect, it'll be a part of the process. You may not have seen it, but it will almost certainly have been a part of the process somewhere in there for your building permit.
Yeah.
You're just doing it by yourself and you're DIYing a lot of this, you can go direct to an energy assessor.
Okay.
So they may need some more information from you to be able to fully assess the home.
Yeah.
But you can work directly with an energy assessor to find out these numbers.
Amazing. So just 2 more questions. Where can people experience a passive house?
The best way to experience a passive house is on International Passive House Open Day. Happens every year in June. So this year it is 28th to the 30th of June. And it means you actually have the option to go in and experience these homes. So one of the things that we
Australia-wide? Sorry.
Yes. Yeah, Australia-wide. I believe it's actually internationally that same week or weekend. Okay. You can learn more on the Australian Passive House Association website, and you'll be able to see all of the details about passive house that we haven't spoken about here, but you'll be able to learn a lot more there.
Amazing. And yeah, I know that we've taken certain steps, but I don't really know, how much of the picture we've got. So I'm certainly interested. I want a 7-star now. So yeah, but anyhow.
We're all learning. We're all and our entire industry is getting better every year. We've got the upgraded National Construction Code changes that are happening as of the 1st of May this year. That's coming through, which means that all new homes have to be at least 7-star. So the entire industry is moving. The awareness in the public is improving. It's fantastic. It's really, really good to see. So if you're feeling like you're still learning, so is everybody else, including all of the professionals in the industry who are living and breathing this. There's so much more to learn and so much more that we can do to improve the existing building stock and the new building stock in our country.
Amazing. And so just one more question. Are there any risks to making your home more energy efficient?
Only if there can be. So the only major risk, if we ignore any OH&S risks about installing things yourself, the only real risk that we see being discussed in the industry a lot is the issue of condensation.
And mold.
Yeah. So once we've improved the energy efficiency of a home enough that there's less ventilation than maybe it would have been used to, if you don't also have those really cold areas like your windows improved as well, you may find that there is an increased risk of condensation in your home. So that's one of the reasons why we want to make sure that we're working through this system in a methodical way and making sure that if you get to a point where you've got a really, really sealed home, you might want to start looking at a mechanical ventilation system. So that's one of the elements of a passive house, is that mechanical ventilation system that draws the old air out, which is usually full of moisture from us breathing and our showers and cooking and plants and all of those things that are bringing moisture into your home. So that's taking that old air out and replacing it with new fresh air. The important thing about those systems, it's different to your general bathroom ventilation, is that they do heat recovery. So it'll change the heat over from the old air to the new air before it pushes it back into your home. Okay. That's the only real risk, is whether or not you end up with condensation. But you can still work with professionals if you find that that's a problem in your home, to find out where it's being caused. Yeah.
And just 1 or 2 other little questions that have just popped into my head. Louver windows, are they like a nightmare for creating a seal?
Louvers don't typically seal as well as other window types. There are some fairly good quality brands out there, but I would only look at going to good quality brands if you want to put louvers in. If you have a home in, say, Queensland, where you're not worried as much about the temperature difference, but you do want to make sure that you've got a lot of ventilation through the house, and that cross ventilation and a couple of ceiling fans will be enough to keep you comfortable. Louvers can be great, but you do have to make sure that you're putting the right windows in the right places for the way that you want to live. So I'm based in Melbourne, so I don't think about dealing with the hot too much. We're mostly worrying about the getting too cold in Melbourne.
And the other thing, you talk about wall insulation. Does that mean that double brick doesn't need insulating?
No. So double brick is usually difficult to insulate because the cavity in between is not a lot, not very big. But that doesn't mean that wall doesn't need insulation. It means that you've got a lot of thermal mass inside your home. So thermal mass is anything that's going to hold a lot of thermal energy. So that's your slab, any internal brick walls. Those are really slow to heat up and really slow to cool down. So they will often stabilize at maybe 18 degrees, and they might always feel a little bit cold. So if you sit too close to a double brick wall, you may always feel a little bit cold, even though your whole room is feeling fine. So there's a lot of different elements to thermal comfort. And we talked a lot about drafts today, but there is also that radiant thermal comfort that we haven't really touched on this time. But the short answer is no, you can still look at options of how you can control the temperature of double brick. It's just not something I think about on a regular basis because we don't do a lot of it in Victoria. I know it's really common in Western Australia though. So if any of your listeners are in Western Australia, definitely reach out to your local professionals because they will be much more across it than me.
Yeah. Well, that brings us to the end of this session. Now, if anyone wants to know more, how can they get in touch with you?
They can get in touch with me through our website, so whiskerarchitecture.com. We're also on all the main socials, so LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, just not Twitter because they don't have pictures or not enough pictures. And we're very visual people. But also there's a lot of great resources out there for anybody wanting to learn more about this, and those will be in the notes that are provided as well. So I really recommend people do a bit of research and reach out to their local professionals.
Thanks so much, Audrey, and thanks for providing such a rich source of resources and links. They will be in the show notes. So if you're listening and you want to see those examples and links that Audrey's shared with us, you just need to download those notes. And thanks again. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks for having me. It's been great being able to talk to you and talk to your listeners. And I can't wait to see everybody improving the build quality of buildings in Australia.
I can't wait either.
This is the She Renovates podcast. To discover how to harness the power of renovating, check out theschoolofrenovating.com.